Shalom, friends. Welcome to this episode of Judaism Unplugged, entitled, Does Anybody Know What Time It Is? In this episode, we will be taking a look at time in general, focusing specifically on the basics of time in the general world and in scientific terms, as a basis for our discussion of how Judaism handles issues and questions of time in establishing the expectations for the Jewish calendar. And I share that with you up front because I think when we talk about Jewish time, there are probably two prevalent stereotypical responses to that concept and those words that may come to mind. One is, the punchline of a joke, the idea that there is something called Jewish Standard Time, which starts several minutes later than whatever the called time is. And as with all stereotypes, it's as true as it is false, but it's also based a little bit in patterns that have been observed and have evolved over time. Jews, as a people who tend to be hospitable to guests and open to welcoming guests, as a culture developed over time the ability to be willing to start a couple of minutes later than announced, so that everybody or more of the everybody could be in the room when whatever the event was that was starting. Now, this can be done in aggravating ways for those who are perpetually on time or early. This can also have some useful side effects. When one's inviting someone to a Jewish wedding or a bar or bat mitzvah celebration, for example, it's not at all uncommon that if the event is starting at 10:30 in the morning, the invitation says, please arrive by 10 or 10:15. And there's a value in that within the Jewish community as well, because that's not downtime, that's not wasted time. That's time when people are coming together earlier than necessary for the reason that brings them together, which allows us to create the community of that event and of that moment. And community being such a large and positive value within the Jewish community, there's a value. And so for the sake of being able to start a little closer to on time and to give ourselves a chance to build community, stereotypically and more often than not in practice, we Jews tend to ask people to come early. And alternately, we may start late. The other thing I think that comes to mind when one speaks of Jewish time, in relationship specifically to fixed dates on the calendar, like holidays, is we often refer to the holidays as coming early or coming late this year. And that may seem like a bizarre concept, but as we'll see as we go through the full discussion of Jewish time, depending on what your calendar is based in and how you organize and order your time, Jewish holidays do not fall on the secular calendar. They fall on a calendar that is organized differently. And as a result, they appear to move around on our American secular calendar. They're much more like Thanksgiving, which always falls on the last Thursday of November, than they are New Year's Day, which always falls on January 1st. Every Jewish holiday has a fixed date, but it's a fixed date on a calendar that's not the secular calendar. And so they do move around. And we'll see over the course of this discussion exactly how and why that motion occurs, within what parameters, and to what value and purpose within the Jewish world. Now, if it sounds like we're starting out with a lot of squirrely things about time, remember the title of this exercise is, Does Anybody Really Know What Time It Is? The quote is a homage to the 70s rock group Chicago for their hit of the same name. But the truth is that even on our secular calendar, whether we recognize it or not, there are a number of truly unusual elements there as well that probably deserve our debunking and attention along the way, as long as we're talking about calendric anomalies and trying to understand calendars and time better. For those of you who may have even a passing background in Latin, for those of us who are aware that we use a decimal system for counting, our counting is based in tens, then you probably have enough information about Latin roots and numbers that at some point you might have come to discover on your own that something has happened to the names of the months on the calendar of the secular calendar over the years. Starting with December, the 12th month of the year, December shares a root with decimal. Decem is the Latin root, the Latin word from which both of those words evolve, means 10. How does the 12th month get a name with a root meaning of 10? And it's not alone. September is based on septem, which is 7. It's the 9th month. If you've ever seen an octagon, it's 8-sided. Why is October the 10th month? Novem is 9 in Latin. Why is November the 11th month? Clearly something has shifted on our secular calendar as well, and we just don't even notice it. One of the two main questions we're going to ask tonight in terms of time in general is, where do you start counting? In the ancient world, most ancient civilizations started their calendars in one of two places. Either in the fall, at the conclusion of the main harvest of the year, for those who lived in the northern hemisphere and had that as the end of summer and the beginning of fall, right around the vernal equinox in middle to late September. Others celebrated at the beginning of the growing season, which would have been the spring, as winter turns to spring in late March. And in the southern hemisphere, those would simply be reversed. So neither of those is anywhere close to January 1st, which is where we celebrate New Year's Day secularly. And we celebrate it as the ball drops at exactly midnight. Midnight means middle of the night. And the length of the night, as we're going to come to see, and as I think we're already aware, varies with the length of the day as the celestial bodies move around in their natural courses. In the dead of winter, the night is way longer than the dead of summer. And therefore, midnight as the middle of the night is hardly an exact place, at least in early time management, and probably the last place we would think to start a day, much less a year. So let's start with that question. Let's start with the even more basic question. What are the elements of natural time? What are the units of time that stand alone and stand separate, that can be seen and observed and measured by ancient people, that come down to us still to this day? And it turns out there are three that fall into that category. There is a day, a period that we now define as 24 hours. It's actually a few seconds less than that, and corresponds to the perception of the amount of time it takes to go through a cycle of sun and moon. whether it's from sunrise to sunset, moonrise to moonset, and the rising of the sun the next day, or whether you start at sunset and moonrise, work through the night and then the day to the preceding sunset of the next day. Roughly a 24-hour period. One of those natural units of time is called a month. Okay, we don't call it a month anymore. We dropped an O someplace. We call it a month. And it's based roughly on the amount of time it takes for the moon to go through its cycle of phases. We'll talk a little bit more about that one when we get to the other major questions. A month, a lunar cycle, actually runs about 29 and a half days. And then there's the cycle of the seasons, a solar cycle, roughly 365 and a quarter days. We call that a year. It's the amount of time it takes for the Earth to work its way circumnavigating around the sun. All the other measurements of time were not easily observable to the naked eye by looking into the sky over the course of the passage of time to the ancients. All the other elements of time and units of time that we talk about are units whose technical definitions are far more complex and far more based in scientific knowledge than the scientific observation that's needed to know a day or a month or a year. And so I think it's useful to distinguish those three elements of time from the rest. Notice, please, what's missing in the middle of those three is the week. And there are those who believe that the week's origins come from watching the most iconic and identifiable phases of the moon, namely full and the two halves and new. But the truth is that a 29 and a half day lunar cycle, a 7-day week is only 28 days. There's a full day and a half that's off there. And so I think we have to look elsewhere to the week. And I think if we look not too hard, we will figure out where it comes from. It falls in a different category. And the smaller elements of time, the ones that subdivide a day, hours and minutes and seconds, those too come later. Because in the ancient world, we're not so much worried about where within the day as we are about the passage of days and large numbers of days that need to be more easily remembered and marked. And if we really are worried about when in the day, we can refer to elements in the sky being in a specific position. If we're talking about noon, we're talking roughly when the sun is at its highest point in the arc of the sky. If we're talking about times in the afternoon, we're watching the sun moving towards the horizon and set. Evening time can be told by knowing where the moon and the stars are at certain seasons and at certain hours. So the ancients were capable of telling time fairly accurately without needing small elements. But those three natural elements served them greatly. They became the basis in the ancient world for how time was told, allowing the two critical questions then to be asked, which was, where do you begin your counting? When does a day start? When does a month start? When does a year start? And the second question, what is the basis of your year? Is your year a lunar year, or is your year a solar year? And depending on how you lived as an ancient community, you were likely to choose one of those over the other. For those who were settled people working the land, where the growing seasons are far closer related to the flow of the seasons during a solar year, more agricultural cultures tended to have calendars that were solar based. The more nomadic your people were, the easier it would be not to have to rely on a solar calendar. But since you're already using the month as a unit of time, to use a lunar calendar and just set a certain number of months as being the equivalent of 1 year. And if you do the heavy lifting of doing the long division, it turns out that the closest number of lunar cycles to a solar cycle is 12. 12 lunar cycles of 29 and a half days come out to about 354 days. And one solar cycle is about 365, and we now know a quarter days. So there's a significant difference of about 11 and a quarter days. But you're closer at 12 months to a solar year, just a little bit short, than you are if you were to go to a lunar year of 13 months, which would actually take you past about 18 and a half days, or 18 days on the other end. So solar and lunar matter, and you can tell a lot about a culture by whether they are more solar or lunar based in terms of how they were more likely to have lived. But the really intriguing question of natural time, it seems to me, is where do you start counting from? Because in each of those cycles, the cycle of a day, the cycle of a month, the cycle of a year, there were two prevalent possibilities that were pretty much co-equal to each other in terms of logical value. We've already seen for a year that most of the ancients either started with the coming back to life of the earth in the spring and the beginning of the growing seasons, or in the fall after the main harvest, after the growing season was over. Particularly true in the Middle East, where there really were only two seasons. There was a dry summer growing season, and there was a rainy off season that they called winter, or that we would call winter. To this day in Jewish liturgy, there are variations in some of the prayers we say on a daily basis, depending on which of those two seasons, the rainy or the dry growing season, we find ourselves in at the time. Because we're asking for slightly different things from God, depending on where we sit in the calendar. Now, for some ancient peoples, the spring made sense because it was a coming back to life not only of the land, but also of the culture of the people of the community, who in areas where particularly there were harsher winters looked more like hibernating bears than full-fledged communities during the winter. Think in the more northern and southern extremes, where the winters get more severe than they do in the more moderate climes, and certainly in the more temperate areas around the tropics and the equator. So coming back to the life of the community was worthy of being celebrated in the spring as well. And it's interesting that there are many cultures that pick up from the end of a calendar cycle in what we would today call February or early March, and have a holiday of significance sometime in that area that then is linked somehow to a holiday at the very beginning of the new year cycle of some significance in that very first month, whether it's after the spring equinox or whatever other reason there is for marking the beginning of the first month of the year in that general area. So if you think to Christianity, there's a connection between Mardi Gras, the night before Ash Wednesday, and Easter Sunday. It's the period of Lent. And if you look at the placement of where those two fall, Easter is the spring festival, the spring holiday. Ash Wednesday, Mardi Gras are the late winter. And Mardi Gras particularly tends to get somewhat out of hand in its celebration. For the Jewish calendar, it's Purim and Passover a month apart. Purim at the end of the calendar year around Mardi Gras, Passover around the time of Easter. And again, you can count that 1 month because they both are mid-month holidays. And you're bridging the end of one year into the beginning of the next, which, as we'll see, is a significant point of departure of the Jewish calendar for reasons that we will discuss at another time. But it seems to me there's also another cultural, ethnic celebration of that same period as Mardi Gras and Purim, both of which tend to involve a heightened amount of partying and alcohol and silliness. And that's St. Patrick's Day. And when you see all three of those very similar looking celebrations falling in such close proximity on the calendar, you start to see a pattern that transcends different cultures and different peoples. It seems like there was a desire and a value and a need to mark the end of winter before the new year began, and to do so by partying pretty hard, which I think goes with that concept of being happy to end the cycle of the cold months and the relative isolation and hibernation that the winter, more extreme weather months would have caused to a community and to a culture. So that would be a reason to start the year in the spring and with the spring. The reason for starting in the fall, or preferring to start in the fall, probably has to do with being an agricultural community more than a nomadic community, because fall is going to be your main harvest. It's going to take the most people hours and energetic work to bring in the harvest. And you're going to want to celebrate. You're going to want to have a celebration right after the harvest is done, hopefully to thank God for the bounteous harvest that's going to get us through the winter, and to start shifting the tone of our prayers to help us make sure we do get through the winter. But you also have the time because the harvest work is now over. And the work of preparing the land for the winter is far less taxing than it is in the spring for getting ready for the growing season. So agriculturally, there might have been a tendency to lean towards the fall over the spring. It's hard to see that from the actual scan of ancient civilizations. But those would have been the two times in the year that you would have looked to see a New Year's celebration. Uniquely amongst ancient civilizations, the Jewish calendar finds a way to mark the start of the new year in both places. Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, comes in the fall. But the counting of months in an annual cycle starts in the spring. And so the cycle of holidays starts in the spring. And Passover is always the holiday in the first month of the year on the Jewish calendar. And part of the reason for that is biblically based. In the book of Exodus, when the Jews are leaving Egypt, which is the historical event that Passover marks and is connected to, the scripture tells us that we are to celebrate on the 15th day of the first month. So Passover must fall in the first month. Interestingly, one of the introductory prayers on Rosh Hashanah states very clearly and unambiguously, on the first day of the seventh month, you shall celebrate a new year. It may sound illogical, but when you see the larger picture, it actually does make sense. So where you start the year informs how you look at the cycle of the year. If you start in the spring, you go through growth and work and celebration, and then you rest. If you start in the fall, you start with celebration of what was, some light preparation, rest and concern, and then the light builds up and you move towards the growing season and through it and end with the heavy work at the end and start the new year with the celebration of what just occurred. Similarly, for a month, do you start your month on the night of the full moon when the light is brightest? Or do you start your month on the new moon when the light is least? If you're tempted to make each new month the start of a celebration to mark the beginning of the new month, I think in the ancient world, you were marginally more likely to start your months on the full moon and thereby know that, weather permitting, you would have good lighting for a longer celebration of that day that could extend into the night because of the brightness of the light reflecting off the moon. If you were an agricultural people, you were probably slightly less likely to care so much about the moon that you need to start the month with the full moon. That was probably a choice made by nomadic people who were freed from having to worry about the solar cycle and were probably on a lunar calendar for a year. They would be more likely to make a big deal out of the new month because it's really the month that they're counting by as opposed to the year. For an agricultural people, months become secondary to seasonal changes, which are harder to see and can't be seen through the moon necessarily. So the decision on where to start your month within the lunar cycle, in the dark or in the light, was made for other reasons. In the case of the Jewish calendar, it was made for consistency. Which leaves the question of, does the day start at sunrise or at sunset? There's a logic to starting the day at sunrise. That's when we start our day. We wake up, we work through the light period, we spend time with our families at home and sleep in the dark period. And yet, in Genesis chapter 1, we're told at the end of God's creation of the first day, there was evening and there was morning, one day. It doesn't say there was morning and there was evening. It says evening first and then morning. And from that, Jewish time says that the day starts with the coming of night. And the year starts with the coming of the fall and the down period of growth and the darker part of the year. And therefore, for the Jewish calendar, the new month begins at the new moon. And you get this phenomenon that Judaism is always counting time moving from darkness toward light. We see an echo of that philosophical distinction in the Hanukkah debate between the schools of Hillel and Shammai about how to light a Hanukkah menorah, a Chanukiah. If you believe that the reason for doing so is because of the miracle oil that lasted for 8 days, that seemed to only be enough for one day when it was found, then the logic of the school of Shammai is compelling. That we should start with all the candles lit the first night and reduce the light each night, just as there was less oil left each night of the miracle. But in the end, the school of Hillel that says you start with one candle to mark the first night and add light every night carries the day in specific because it says this way you are increasing the light and the joy in the miracle every day. But because Hillel's answer is consistent with the general Jewish view of time, which is to start in darkness and move towards light. There's a lot of other ways that symbolically that comes up over the spread of Jewish history and the flow of Jewish history, and we'll see it and we'll mark it as we go. But for now, I leave you with this thought. What are we celebrating at midnight of December 31st into January 1st on the secular calendar? Why are the months on a secular calendar, with the exception of February, 30 and 31 days? Why have the names of those months at the end of the secular calendar, September, October, November, December, become divorced from the meaning of their linguistic roots? I'll answer the last one for you. And with this, we'll close. It has to do also with why February specifically, where it is on the calendar, is the short month. Our secular calendar today, we refer to as the Gregorian calendar because of the tinkering and changes that were made to an earlier version called the Julian calendar by Pope Gregory, someplace in around the 17th or 18th century. The Julian calendar goes back to Roman times. And specifically, one of the key players apparently in its configuration as it comes down is the nephew of Julius Caesar, Augustus. Julius Caesar, having been a great figure prior to the establishment of the Roman monarchy with Augustus. And so Augustus wanted to honor both himself and his uncle. July is for Julius Caesar. August is for Augustus. And it would not do for either of those months to have fewer or more days than the other, or any other month for that matter. So each of those months were going to have 31 days. The Roman calendar was solar-based because the Romans were an agrarian people. So they were basically alternating 30 and 31 day months. And if you think about 30 days have September, April, June, and November, if you start that just for the sake of discussion with April, April has 30 days, May has 31, June has 30 days, July has 31. August should have 30 days, it has 31, so September has 30, October has 31, November has 30, December has 31. Someplace you needed to borrow a day to have those two 31-day months in a row, because this way, when you come to December, January starting the new year is another 31-day month. So poor February is the one that loses the day. But if you go back to what the pre-Julian calendar was, there's good reason to believe that if it was 365 days, February had 29. Because if you alternate 30 and 31 consistently, you end up with 366, not 365. And therefore, they would have taken the one day away at the end to square everything up, which would have made February the end of the year. Which would have made March the start of the year, consistent with other ancient traditions. And it would have made September the 7th month starting from March, October the 8th month, November the 9th month, and December the 10th month. And suddenly the Roman calendar that becomes the Julian calendar, that becomes the Gregorian calendar, makes a lot more sense. So there are answers to be found in logic and in history that reinforce the general statements we've made here. I'm going to stop for now with this discussion of general time, and in a separate video discuss how Judaism approaches this and structures time as the introduction to what the Jewish calendar looks like. As always, I hope this has been useful information. I look forward to your questions and feedback. And until we meet again, whether it's in this medium or in other places, I bid you all shalom.